Most organizations say they value diversity. They invest in inclusion, they build programs, but when you look at performance, the results are often uneven. This is the People Dividend, I'm Mike Horne, and today I'm joined by Norm Jones, leader CEO at Integrated Diversity, an advisor to organizations on inclusion and performance. Norm, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Mike. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you as a returning guest. We don't have many of them, so that's a real plus for me as well. Norm, you've spent years working with organizations on diversity and inclusion. When you step back from that work, what do organizations still misunderstand about what this actually requires?
It's a great starting question. I think most organizations fundamentally misunderstand the salience and value proposition of DEI as that which enhances the work that should already be happening. And all too often, even in organizations that I would label as a bit more progressive, maybe in their DEI work, still struggle with making that work too peripheral, too adjacent to the fundamental core business or core value proposition. And so I always enter into workspaces with the intention of helping leaders integrate that which we've learned about diversity, equity, inclusion, even justice work into the fundamental work of the organization. And so I think that work is, in fact, the leader's core responsibility. That is the core work of the most senior leaders in the organization.
Yeah, it seems to me, I mean, there's often a strong intention to build inclusive organizations, or at least there has been, but that intention doesn't always translate into outcomes. So, where's the breakdown happen?
I believe the breakdown is largely about a hyper focus or an over indexing, let's call it, of a focus on demography. And that, frankly, is an indication of what I would call vestiges of the past. That in this country in particular, we have struggled for so long to just get particular individuals and groups and communities in the door, that we are still way back at, representation. And I'm the last person to suggest that representation is not important. However, it is a bit of a starting place. It's very hard to do the work of inclusion, and certainly much harder to do the work of equity if you don't even have a representative community, right? A community that represents a constituency or the people you serve or the workforce you actually want to represent. So part of the place where we're stuck has to do with this preoccupation with paying so much attention to who's at the table and who's not at the table, that we're not actually getting to the behaviors that should be shifting and transforming as a result of who's at the table. If we can get to that part, then we can actually start to dig into the work and the interpersonal dynamics that start to shift when you have more difference around the leadership table in particular.
Well, those are really useful distinctions, Norm. And I'm thinking about what's the cost when that gap between representation and real inclusion and involvement, what's the cost when that gap isn't addressed?
Well, fundamentally, I think the cost is has to do with sustainability. I firmly believe this is not lip service from me. I firmly believe that organizations that don't actually believe and buy into the fact that diverse teams bring greater strength, greater value, and strengthen the bottom line, quite frankly, will not survive. And that's not just because those organizations don't have adequate quote unquote representation among leader ranks and maybe even in the workforce. It's because the absence of diverse and varied perspectives will show up in the quality of the service you're providing, the product you're providing, because you simply have too much homogeneity in your decision making frameworks. And that might be in the context of race, might be in the context of gender, but it can also be in the context of ideology, of course. And so we bring different perspectives to the table because we actually want to strengthen the value proposition of that which we say in the market is worth it, right? It's worth the price. But the price we pay for that as leaders is that we have to be able to bring diverse perspectives to the table to make better decisions and more sustainable decisions.
Hey, well, let's focus on that theme because at the end of the day, organizations run on decisions, and those decisions move through people. In your experience, how does inclusion or the lack of it actually affect decision making?
Well, I think there is an important intersection between organizational values, mission, and I would even go as far as to say plans and goals, whether the strategy is an actual strategic plan or something a bit more ethereal. Those concrete, measurable goals require decisions that need to be tested by all different sorts of perspectives. You know, you need the person at the table who is the what if contingency person. You need the person at the table who is sort of the naysayer that sort of defaults to the notion of something not working, right? But then you don't get the B and C plan if you don't have that person at the table. You need the person at the table who's saying, okay, this message makes sense for today's audience, but who might our audience be 2 years from now? And demographically speaking, would this message land with that particular community or that particular demographic? So, at the level of pragmatism, I think decision making requires many different perspectives that may or may not be around that decision making table if a leader is not thinking in an inclusive way.
Sure. Let's explore that further. A lot of organizations treat diversity and inclusion as initiatives,
Yeah.
programs,
Yep.
efforts.
Yep.
If it's not directly tied to performance, it often gets deprioritized. So, how do you connect this clearly to performance and outcomes?
Oh, well, one thing I did when I founded Integrated Diversity is to situate that very intentional verb in the name of the business. It really is about integration. And then the question becomes, what does integration mean? What does that look like? And how is it measured? I'm a person who actually thinks that DEI efforts, quote unquote, should be part of the way we evaluate performance. And I recognize that the vast majority of organizations, public or private, are not there. But part of the value in tying DEI efforts to performance is that it forces leaders to think about that which is actually measurable, not necessarily in terms of programmatic goals, but in terms of how we identify increased competency around diversity, equity, and inclusion fluency or literacy. So, what might that look like? In the HR space, I often give the example of the 22 plus forms of bias that we know exist in decision making, not just in hiring, but in the way we make decisions writ large. That fact shows up in the way HR offices situate themselves, in the way they actually organize their hiring practices, their recruiting practices, their retention practices, the way they measure employee engagement, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're thinking about the work, then we have the opportunity to lay over that work approaches that are a bit more sophisticated when it comes to diversity, that which has to do with demography, inclusion, that which has to do with the way we behave as a result of that demography, or even equity, the way we actually shape policies and the way we think about infrastructure and protocols related to who's actually in the workforce. So, if we can find a way to actually identify many of these competencies across departments, whether it's HR or other leadership areas, then we begin to think about how to actually measure increased performance in those spaces. And it starts with leaders because leaders are the ones that are making decisions about the way organizations get shaped and the way the workplace culture gets shaped as well.
Well, and it really goes to the core of this show because at the core of this show is a simple idea: people drive performance. But in my observations, organizations often separate inclusion from how work actually gets done. What do leaders miss and about how inclusion shows up operationally?
This goes back, Mike, to what I said at the very beginning that I think there has been a kind of hyper focus on demography. And so you might imagine if I believe that I've sort of done the work more or less of DEI by hiring Norm, and Norm is Black or Norm is from a certain geographic area, then the inclusive practices sort of happen by default in my mind, perhaps, right? Now that Norm is in the door, he will figure out how to sort of acculturate himself or become acclimated to a preset culture, as opposed to thinking about how the organization is potentially changed by Norm's presence in the space. And therefore, we might want to think differently about our onboarding practices, about the kinds of questions we ask on engagement surveys, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this notion of inclusion, again, has more to do with trying to rewire the work that we're doing anyway, with an eye toward who's new in the community and how does that community shift as a result of difference, as opposed to thinking about sort of the demographic side of things that we would fill out on a survey to say that our workforce is now quote unquote more diverse. It has very little to do with how the culture then actually shifts as a result of this diversity.
And Norm, what actually changes when inclusion is working?
It's such a beautiful question. Well, I guess I would use the word change, but I also like the word shift. I like the word transform, because change, especially in the organization development world, can mean something very particular. But I think of my consulting engagements, for example, as journeys. And I tell clients sometimes that I'm going on the journey with them. I'm there to support them. I'm there to advise them. I'm there to offer up opinions and advice when asked, if I have some observations that they may or may not see from their perspective. And when you think about this as a journey, it invites an opportunity for you to notice what you should notice about yourself and how that then impacts and influences others. And when you look at it in that way, you start to make observations about what's going on in the environment. This is why I consider the work quite ecological in nature, right? Because it's not about a static mission statement or a sort of concrete value proposition as much as it is about noticing how the day to day operation starts to morph when you have different perspectives, different stances, different methodologies, different approaches and strategies in the mix. And that is inevitably a follow on when you bring difference into a community. So, what changes, what shifts, what morphs, Mike, is the actual culture, the lifeblood, the connective tissue between people. It is about the work, yes, but it's also about the interplay of human dynamics and the way people start to see themselves and their work differently as a result of different frames brought about brought about by different perspectives around the table. That is the human project, right? That is what happens when you step outside your comfort zone to actually think about what's on the other side of your idea. That's
Right.
what happens, and that's what
Yeah.
happens in workplaces.
And it seems that a lot of performance issues show up as misalignment, different perspectives, different assumptions. And when those aren't surfaced, what happens?
Well, it becomes at sort of a crude level. It has the potential to become a very serious equity issue because I guess it depends on the sort of maturity of the organization, the sophistication of its systems, but to not deploy a kind of due diligence around making sure that an employee understands the expectations of the role, and also making sure that the employee understands who you are as a manager, as a leader, which is both about the sort of concrete work and about the way you work together, which again is a journey. You have a starting place and then it kind of morphs. To not get that clarity or focus on that clarity or kind of privilege the importance of that clarity as early as possible is a kind of dereliction of duty, I think. And so if these disconnects are showing up in performance evaluations or in sort of, I don't know, like a first 90-day check-in or something like that, it's too late in some ways. I'm not saying it's not salvageable, but I don't think we pay enough attention to creating the space we intend to work in, the space where we intend to co-create, right? Actually affirming the importance of understanding working relationships. I work with one organization that uses, I don't like the term, maybe for obvious reasons, but they use owner's manuals as a concept for helping each other understand sort of how you tick and what really brings the best out of you and what does the opposite. And I like the concept because I think it says something really beautiful about the way leaders desire to instantiate clarity in their working relationships. And I just don't think we do enough of it. And I don't think we do it early enough in our working relationships in the workplace.
Yeah, and for everyone who's listening, for all the people who lead teams or lead organizations, what's one shift they can make immediately that would improve both, that would improve performance and how they lead their teams? What's one shift that leaders could make immediately in this space?
I think I would put this in the engagement category, but I've been thinking about and talking about a lot recently wants and needs and the difference between the two and the sort of human impulse in the workplace to sort of choose one over the other as opposed to choosing both because they are different but equally as important. And so I think the sort of exercise of saying out loud that wants and needs in the workplace are both important and both deserve attention, and that the journey that you're taking with a team should center and appreciate the way what we want and what we need out of our work environment, that changes over time, and to have more focused conversation about that literally provides content for staff meetings, provides content for strategy meetings, provides content even for goals. But because that's focused more on relationships than the quote unquote work, I think we can sort of skip over that or gloss over that or wait until we're in sort of a retreat setting to talk about those kinds of things. When in reality, that is the secret sauce of getting good work done by and through people.
And just before we get to a final question, perhaps, is if people were interested in exploring more of your work, how would they get in touch with you?
So I'll offer two websites. One is for my actual business, Integrated Diversity. That's integrateddiversity.org, two Ds. And I also have a personal website, normjonesphd.com, that displays a little bit more of my research interests and what I have going on civically and some of my other projects. So I'd offer those two resources
Well,
to you.
that's great. And just as we wrap up, when all of this is working at its best, what's different about how organizations operate? And we explored this a little bit, but just as a parting thought, I mean, what's different when all of this is working really well?
I think the value proposition is more credible. I think you attend to the sustainability of the organization in a more intentional way because you've invited in more perspectives. And I also think you make more space for innovation, which means that the chances of the organization transcending the kind of VUCA environment that we live in that can sink an organization literally overnight in some cases, you mitigate against that because you are anticipating difference. And it's not just difference in the demographic sense, but it's difference in terms of the landscape, right? The environment in which the organization exists. And so I think we owe it to ourselves and our communities to create more sustainable organizations by really leaning into the value proposition of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Oh, that's really wonderful, Norm. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you having returning to this podcast. Your earlier appearance may have been when we were Authentic Change. So for anyone
Yes,
listening, can go
that's
back
right.
into the archives there. But again, Norm, I really appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you for having me, Mike. This is fun.
Yeah, this is the people dividend. If you're serious about performance, start with people. Until the next episode, stay well.